It was 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon when the lawyer handed me an envelope with my name written on it in Daniel's handwriting. I was sitting in his office downtown, surrounded by Daniel's family who were all there for the will reading. His wife Patricia was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. His son Ryan and daughter Michelle sat on either side of her, looking appropriately somber. And there I was, the mistress, squeezed into a chair in the corner like I didn't belong. Which I didn't. Not really. But Daniel had insisted I be there. The lawyer said Daniel had left specific instructions that I receive this envelope before anything else was read. Patricia had looked at me like I was dirt on her shoe. Michelle had actually rolled her eyes. Ryan had just stared at his phone. None of them had any idea what was coming. Neither did I. Inside that envelope was a key, an address in Industrial Vermont, and a note that said 3 words: "Open it alone." What I found in that garage 48 hours later would explain 10 years of Saturday disappearances, expose a secret that Daniel had protected with his life, and put me in the crosshairs of people who'd do anything to get their hands on what he'd been hiding. I'm Sarah Bennett. I'm 37 years old, and I'd been Daniel Morrison's mistress for 12 years. He was 63 when he died of a heart attack last month. We met at a tech conference in Burlington back in 2013. I was working in software development for a startup. Daniel was the founder and CEO of Morrison Technologies, a company that built industrial automation systems for manufacturing plants. We'd ended up sitting next to each other at a panel discussion about artificial intelligence. He'd leaned over during a particularly boring presentation and whispered that the speaker had no idea what he was talking about. I'd laughed, trying to be quiet. After the panel, we'd gone for coffee, then dinner. Then he'd told me he was married, but things were complicated. I'd heard that line before. I should have walked away. But Daniel was brilliant and funny, and he looked at me like I was the smartest person in the room, so I stayed. For 12 years, I stayed. Our relationship was simple. We'd meet for dinner every Wednesday at a small restaurant in Montpelier, where nobody knew either of us. He'd text me most nights around 10, after Patricia went to bed, and we'd talk about work or life or whatever was on our minds. Sometimes he'd come to my apartment on Sunday afternoons when he said he was playing golf. We'd order pizza and watch movies and pretend for a few hours that we were a normal couple. It wasn't much, but it was what we had, and I'd convinced myself it was enough because loving Daniel, even in pieces, was better than not loving him at all. But every Saturday, Daniel disappeared. Not to see me. Somewhere else. He'd leave his house at 8 in the morning and wouldn't come back until dark. Patricia had complained about it for years. She'd thought he was having another affair. Maybe with someone besides me. His kids had thought he'd joined some weird cult, or was having a breakdown. When they'd asked him where he went, Daniel would just say he needed time to think, to work on a personal project, that it wasn't anything they needed to worry about. Nobody believed him. But nobody could prove anything either. He paid cash everywhere, so there were no credit card records. He didn't have GPS tracking on his phone. For 10 years, every single Saturday, Daniel vanished into thin air. I'd asked him about it once, maybe 5 years ago. We'd been lying on my couch and I'd said, "Where do you go on Saturdays?" He'd gotten this look on his face, half sad and half protective. He'd said, "I'm working on something important, something I can't explain yet." I'd said, "Is it another woman?" He'd laughed and said, "No, nothing like that. It's just a project I need to finish alone. When it's done, you'll understand." I'd let it drop. I figured everyone was entitled to their secrets, even in a relationship built on lies to everyone else. Then, Daniel died. Massive heart attack while sitting at his desk at work. 57 years old. Gone in minutes. I'd gotten the call from his secretary who knew about us, who'd always been kind to me. I'd driven to the hospital, but Patricia was already there with Ryan and Michelle. I'd stayed in the parking lot, crying in my car, unable to go inside. I hadn't been at the funeral. Patricia had made it clear I wasn't welcome. But Daniel's lawyer had called 3 days later and said Daniel had left instructions for me to be present at the will reading, that I was specifically mentioned. Patricia had been furious when I'd shown up, but the lawyer had been firm. Daniel's wishes were Daniel's wishes. The lawyer had started by reading the standard stuff. The house in Stowe went to Patricia. The company shares were split between Ryan and Michelle. Various investments and retirement accounts were divided among family members. Then he'd pulled out my envelope. He'd said Daniel had left this for me with instructions that it be given to me first, before the rest of the will was read. He'd handed it across his desk. Patricia had said, "What is that?" The lawyer had said, "I don't know." Mr. Morrison sealed it himself. I'd opened the envelope with shaking hands while everyone watched. Inside was a small brass key, the kind that opens a padlock, and a piece of paper with an address written in Daniel's handwriting. 362 Industrial Park Road, Barre, Vermont, and below that, 3 words. Open it alone. Patricia had demanded to know what the address was. I'd said I didn't know. She'd said, "Let me see that." I'd folded the paper and put it in my purse. The lawyer had said, "Ms. Bennett, do you know what's at that location?" I'd said no, honestly. Daniel never told me. Michelle had said, "This is ridiculous. Why would Dad leave her an address?" Ryan had said, "What else did he leave her?" The lawyer had continued reading. Daniel had left me $50,000 in cash. Not a huge amount given his wealth, but enough to make Patricia's face turn red. He'd also left me a letter, sealed, to be delivered separately. The lawyer had handed me another envelope. Patricia had stood up and said, "This is insulting. He leaves his whore $50,000 and some mysterious address while his family gets the scraps." The lawyer had said, "Mrs. Morrison, your husband left you a house worth $1.2 million and assets worth several million more. You're hardly getting scraps." The rest of the will reading had been tense. Patricia had glared at me the whole time. Michelle had made several comments under her breath about homewreckers. Ryan had just looked uncomfortable. When it was over, I'd gotten out of there as fast as I could. I'd driven home and opened Daniel's letter. It was 2 pages, handwritten, dated 3 months before he died. He'd written that he loved me, that I'd been the best part of his life for 12 years, that he was sorry for never being brave enough to leave Patricia and be with me properly. Then he'd written about the address. He'd said he'd been working on something for 10 years, every Saturday in that garage. Something nobody knew about. Something important. He said I was the only person he trusted to decide what to do with it. That I needed to see it before anyone else did. That I needed to understand what it meant before I made any decisions. He said the key would open the garage. He said to go alone. He said to be careful. And he said that once I saw what was inside, I'd understand why he'd kept it secret for so long. I'd stared at that letter for an hour, reading it over and over. What could Daniel have been working on for 10 years that required secrecy? What could be so important that he'd spent every Saturday for a decade on it? What could possibly be dangerous enough that he'd warned me to be careful? I'd pulled up the address on my phone. It was in an industrial park outside Barre, about 45 minutes from my apartment. The satellite view showed a row of metal warehouses with garage doors. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained anything. I'd waited until Saturday, same day Daniel always went. I'd left early, around 7, and driven to Barre. The industrial park was at the edge of town, past the granite quarries, in an area that looked half abandoned. Most of the warehouses had faded signs and broken windows. Unit 362 was at the end of the row, separated from the others by an empty lot. It looked like all the rest. Metal siding, roll-up garage door, small window on the side too dirty to see through. There was a heavy padlock on the door. No company name. No indication of what might be inside. I'd parked and sat in my car for 10 minutes, holding that brass key, trying to work up the courage to go inside. My hands were shaking. My stomach was churning. What if it was something illegal? What if Daniel had been involved in something dangerous, and now I was walking into the middle of it? What if someone was watching? I'd looked around the empty lot. Nobody. Just me and the wind blowing trash across the cracked pavement. I'd gotten out of my car, walked to the garage door, and fit the key into the padlock. It turned smoothly. The lock clicked open. I'd rolled up the garage door, the metal screaming on its tracks, and stepped inside. The garage was dark. I'd fumbled for a light switch, found it, flipped it on. Fluorescent bulbs had flickered to life overhead, and I'd stood there, frozen, staring at what Daniel had spent 10 years building. The garage was maybe 30 feet by 30 feet. The walls were lined with workbenches covered in tools, soldering irons, oscilloscopes, computer monitors, spools of wire, circuit boards. In the center of the space sat a machine. It was about the size of a refrigerator, built from machined metal and glass panels. Cables ran from it to a bank of computers along one wall. Cooling fans hummed quietly. LED indicators blinked in various colors. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie, like something that shouldn't exist. I'd walked closer, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. There was a label on the side of the machine, handwritten in Daniel's writing. Prototype 7, Quantum Processing Unit. Below that, another note. Patent pending. Do not disclose. I'd felt my heart start pounding. Quantum processing. I knew enough about technology to understand what that meant. Quantum computers were supposed to be the next revolution in computing. They could solve problems in seconds that would take traditional computers millions of years. Every tech company in the world was racing to build one, and Daniel had apparently been building one in secret, in a garage in Vermont, for 10 years. There were notebooks stacked on the workbenches. I'd picked one up and flipped through it. Pages and pages of calculations, circuit diagrams, notes about experiments and failures and successes. Daniel's handwriting covered every page, dates going back to 2015. I'd picked up another notebook. More of the same, years of work documented in meticulous detail. How he'd solved problems, what materials he'd tested, which designs had worked and which hadn't. It was like reading someone's diary, except instead of feelings and daily events, it was quantum physics and electrical engineering. On one of the computers, there was a folder labeled "For Sarah." I'd opened it. Inside were dozens of documents, technical specifications for the machine, patent applications that Daniel had drafted but never filed, research papers he'd written explaining his breakthrough, and a video file dated 3 months ago, right around when he'd written that letter. I'd clicked on it. Daniel's face had filled the screen. He'd been sitting in this garage looking tired but excited. He'd said, "Sarah, if you're watching this, I'm gone. And you're probably standing in my garage wondering what the hell I've been doing for the past 10 years. Let me explain." He'd talked for 20 minutes. He'd explained that he'd stumbled onto a new approach to quantum computing about 12 years ago, right around when we'd met. Something that didn't require the massive infrastructure and cooling systems that made most quantum computers impractical. He'd built the first prototype in his basement, but Patricia had almost discovered it, so he'd rented this garage for privacy. Every Saturday for 10 years, he'd come here to work. Testing, refining, improving. He'd said he'd finally gotten it working reliably about 6 months ago. That it was a genuine breakthrough, that it could revolutionize computing, that it was worth potentially billions of dollars if commercialized properly. But Daniel hadn't told anyone, not his company, not his business partners, not the scientific community, because he'd realized something important. This technology was dangerous. In the wrong hands, a quantum computer this powerful could break most encryption systems protecting financial data, government secrets, personal information. It could be weaponized. It could cause catastrophic damage to privacy and security worldwide. He'd said he'd spent months agonizing over what to do. Should he publish it and hope the good uses outweighed the bad? Should he destroy it and bury the research? Should he patent it and try to control how it was used? He couldn't decide, so he'd left the decision to me. The video had ended with Daniel looking directly into the camera. He'd said, "Sarah, you're the smartest person I know. You understand technology. You understand people. I trust you to figure out what to do with this. Maybe you'll see something I missed. Maybe you'll have the courage to make the hard choice I couldn't make. Whatever you decide, know that I believe in you, that I love you, that giving this to you is the most important thing I've ever done. Take care of yourself. Be careful. And remember, once people know this exists, everything changes." I'd stood there in that garage, surrounded by 10 years of Daniel's secret work, trying to process what I'd just learned. Daniel had built a quantum computer, a working, practical quantum computer that could change the world, and he'd given it to me. Not to his family, not to his company. To me, the mistress, the secret girlfriend, the person nobody thought deserved anything from him. He'd trusted me with the most valuable thing he'd ever created. and I had no idea what to do with it. I'd spent hours in that garage that first day, reading his notebooks, watching more videos he'd left, trying to understand the technical details of what he'd built. Daniel had been a genius. That much was clear. The solutions he'd found to problems that stumped entire research teams were elegant and surprisingly simple once you understood them. He'd essentially figured out how to build a quantum computer the size of a refrigerator that could operate at room temperature. No massive cooling systems, no billion-dollar facilities. Just this machine in a garage that could outperform anything that currently existed. The implications were staggering. If this technology got out, every encryption system in the world would be vulnerable. Online banking, government communications, corporate secrets, personal data. Everything that relied on encryption for security would be at risk. But the potential benefits were enormous too. Medical research that currently took years could be done in hours. Climate modeling could become exponentially more accurate. New materials could be designed. New drugs discovered. Problems that seemed unsolvable could suddenly have solutions. It was both a miracle and a weapon. I'd locked up the garage and driven home in a daze. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Daniel had left me. The responsibility of it. The weight of deciding what to do. Part of me wanted to call a reporter, make it public. Let the world figure it out. Part of me wanted to burn everything and pretend I'd never seen it. Part of me wanted to sell it to the highest bidder and never worry about money again. I didn't know what the right answer was. I didn't know if there was a right answer. The next morning, Patricia called me. She said she wanted to know what was at that address Daniel had left me. I said it was personal. She said, "Everything my husband owned is my business." I said, "He gave me the address. That makes it my business." She'd threatened to sue me, said she'd drag me through court, said she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I was. I'd hung up on her. An hour later, Ryan called. He was more polite but equally insistent. He said his father had obviously left me something valuable, that as his son he deserved to know what it was, that the family had a right to Daniel's legacy. I'd told him the same thing I'd told Patricia. Daniel had left it to me. I'd figure out what to do with it. That night, someone broke into my apartment. I'd come home from work to find my door jimmied open, my place trashed. They'd gone through everything. My laptop was gone. My files were scattered. My bedroom had been torn apart. Whoever had done it was looking for something specific. Looking for information about the address. Looking for the key. I'd been carrying both in my purse, thank God. I'd called the police, filed a report, but I knew they wouldn't find who'd done it. I knew it had to be someone from Daniel's family, or maybe someone from his company who'd heard about the mysterious address. Someone wanted to know what Daniel had been hiding. I'd started going to the garage every day after work. It felt safer there, in that industrial park where nobody knew what was inside. I'd been reading through Daniel's research, trying to understand not just how the machine worked, but why he'd built it. In one of his later notebooks, I'd found a note that explained everything. He'd written, "I built this because I wanted to prove I was more than just a businessman, more than just someone who made money off other people's inventions. I wanted to create something that mattered, something that would outlive me, something that would change the world. But now that I've done it, I'm terrified, because changing the world isn't always good, and I don't trust myself to decide which kind of change this will cause." Reading that had broken my heart. Daniel had spent 10 years in this garage, building something incredible, and he'd died without ever knowing what it would become, without ever seeing it change anything. He'd kept it secret because he was afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of the responsibility, and he'd passed that fear on to me. I'd sat on the garage floor, surrounded by his notebooks, and cried for the man who'd loved me enough to trust me with his greatest achievement, but not enough to share his life with me openly. A week after the break-in, a man showed up at the garage. I'd been there working late, reading through patent applications Daniel had drafted, when I'd heard a car pull up outside. I'd looked out the window and seen a black sedan. A man in an expensive suit had gotten out. He'd walked straight to the garage door, like he knew exactly where he was going. I'd felt my stomach drop. I'd grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. The man had knocked on the door. He'd said, "Miss Bennett, I know you're in there. I'd like to talk to you about Daniel Morrison's work. My name is Richard Chen, and I was Daniel's business partner. I'd opened the door. Richard had been in his 50s, well-groomed, with the confident air of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. He'd said, "Daniel and I started Morrison Technologies together 20 years ago. I've been trying to understand what he was working on here. I knew he was building something. He'd been distant for years, distracted, spending money on equipment I couldn't account for. When he died, I thought I'd finally get answers. But he left everything to you instead." Richard had walked into the garage without being invited. He'd looked at the quantum computer, at the notebooks, at the equipment, and I'd seen his expression change. Recognition, understanding, greed. He'd said, "Jesus Christ, he actually built it. A quantum computer. Do you have any idea what this is worth?" I'd said, "I have some idea." Richard had turned to me, his eyes intense. He'd said, "Ms. Bennett, I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. $5 million for everything in this garage. The machine, the research, the patents. You walk away, I take over. Everyone wins." I'd felt anger rising in my chest. I'd said, "This isn't for sale." Richard had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. He'd said, "Everything is for sale at the right price. 10 million. Final offer." I'd said, "Daniel left this to me because he trusted me to decide what to do with it. Not sell it to the first person who offers money." Richard's smile had disappeared. He'd said, "Daniel was naive. He built something that could be worth billions, and he hid it in a garage like a toy. This technology needs to be developed properly, by people who understand business, by people who can bring it to market," I'd said, "or weaponized by people who don't care about the consequences." Richard had stepped closer. He'd said, "Ms. Bennett, you seem like a smart woman. Smart enough to understand that you're in over your head. This is quantum computing. This is national security. This is technology that countries go to war over. You think you can just sit on this and nobody will care? The moment word gets out about what Daniel built, you'll have governments, corporations, intelligence agencies, all coming after it. And you want that life? Or do you want to take my money and walk away while you still can?" I'd said, "I'm not afraid of you." Richard had said, "You should be, because I'm offering you an exit. Other people won't be so generous." He'd left his business card and walked out. I'd locked the garage door behind him and stood there shaking. Richard was right about one thing. I was in over my head. I didn't know how to handle this. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if keeping Daniel's secret was brave or stupid. All I knew was that Daniel had asked me to be careful, and men like Richard Chen were exactly what he'd been worried about. People who'd see dollar signs instead of consequences. People who'd do anything to control this technology. People who didn't care about the damage it might cause. That night, I'd made copies of everything. All the notebooks, all the computer files, all the research. I'd uploaded encrypted backups to cloud storage. I'd sent physical copies to a lawyer I trusted with instructions to release them if anything happened to me. If someone wanted Daniel's work badly enough to hurt me for it, I was going to make sure it wouldn't disappear with me. At least this way. His research would survive even if I didn't. It was the best insurance I could think of. Patricia called again the next day. This time she was crying. She'd said, "Sarah, please. I need to know what Daniel was doing. I need to understand why he kept secrets from me. Why he spent every Saturday somewhere else. Was it another woman? Was it you? Was it something worse?" I'd felt bad for her, honestly, for all her faults. Patricia had been married to Daniel for 35 years. She'd raised his kids. She'd built a life with him. And he'd shut her out of this huge part of himself. I'd said, "Patricia, it wasn't another woman. It was a project, something he was building." She'd said, "What kind of project?" I'd said, "Something important. Something he didn't know how to share." Patricia had been quiet for a long time. Then she'd said, "Did he love you more than me?" I'd said, "I don't know. I think he loved both of us for different reasons, and I think he was terrified of hurting anyone." Patricia had hung up without saying goodbye. 2 weeks after Richard's visit, someone tried to break into the garage. I'd installed a security camera after my apartment got broken into. The footage showed 2 men with crowbars trying to pry open the door at 3 in the morning. They'd given up after 20 minutes when they couldn't break the reinforced lock I'd installed, but the message was clear. People knew something valuable was in there. People wanted it, and they weren't going to stop trying. I'd called the police, but they said without identifying the men, there wasn't much they could do. I'd started carrying pepper spray. I'd started looking over my shoulder constantly. I'd started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. Daniel's gift was turning into a nightmare. I'd spent a month going through every document Daniel left, reading every notebook, watching every video, trying to understand not just the technology but Daniel's thinking. Why he'd built it, what he'd hoped it would accomplish, what he'd feared it might cause. And slowly, a plan had started forming in my mind. A way to honor Daniel's work without letting it fall into the wrong hands. A way to ensure his breakthrough helped people instead of hurting them. It wasn't perfect. It probably wasn't even legal. But it was the best idea I had. Daniel had written in one of his notebooks that open source technology was the only truly democratic technology. That when everyone had access, no one could monopolize it. No one could weaponize it without everyone else having the same capability. It was mutually assured destruction applied to innovation. If everyone had quantum computing, then everyone would have to adapt their security to deal with quantum computing. Banks would upgrade encryption. Governments would protect secrets differently. The playing field would stay level, just at a higher level of technology. It was dangerous. It would cause chaos in the short term. But in the long term, it might be the only way to prevent one country or one company from having an insurmountable advantage. I decided to release everything. All of Daniel's research. All the plans for building the machine. All the code. All the documentation. I'd release it publicly, for free, to anyone who wanted it. I'd make it impossible to patent or control or monopolize. I'd turn Daniel's secret into everyone's knowledge. It would honor his work by ensuring it changed the world, even if the change was messy and complicated. And it would protect me by making the information worthless to steal. You can't profit from something everyone already has. But first, I had to deal with Daniel's family. I'd called Patricia and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop in Burlington. She'd come, flanked by Ryan and Michelle, clearly expecting a fight. I'd brought printouts of some of Daniel's research. Not the critical stuff. Just enough to show them what he'd been doing. I'd explained that Daniel had built a quantum computer. That it was potentially revolutionary. That he'd left it to me to decide what to do with it. Patricia had been stunned. Michelle had said, "Why would he leave something that important to you instead of his family?" I'd said, "Because he knew I'd understand what it meant. That I'd think about the consequences instead of just the money." Ryan had asked what I was going to do with it. I'd told them my plan. Release everything publicly. Make it open source. Ensure no one could control it. Patricia had looked horrified. She'd said, "You're going to just give away something worth billions?" I'd said, "I'm going to do what Daniel would have wanted. Make sure his work helps people instead of enriching corporations." Michelle had said, "This is insane. You're insane. You're throwing away our father's legacy." I'd said, "No, I'm protecting it. Your father didn't want this technology controlled by people like Richard Chen. He wanted it to change the world in the right way, and this is the only way I can think of to make that happen." Patricia had stood up to leave. She'd said, "I'm going to sue you. I'm going to prove you're not mentally competent to make this decision." Ryan had stayed sitting. He'd said, "Mom, wait." He'd looked at me and said, "Did my dad really trust you with this?" I'd said, "Yes." He did. Ryan had nodded slowly. He'd said, "Then maybe we should trust you too." Michelle had said, "Ryan, are you kidding?" But Ryan had shaken his head. He'd said, "Dad spent 10 years on this. He left it to Sarah for a reason. Maybe we should respect that." Patricia had stormed out. Michelle had followed her, but Ryan had stayed. He'd said, "For what it's worth, I think you're probably doing the right thing, even if it's crazy." I'd released Daniel's research 3 days later. I'd uploaded everything to multiple open source platforms. The technical specifications, the build instructions, the code, the notebooks, everything. Within hours, it had been downloaded thousands of times. Within days, millions. The tech community had exploded. Forums were full of people analyzing Daniel's work, confirming that it worked, starting their own builds. News articles ran stories about the mysterious quantum computer breakthrough released by an anonymous source. Universities announced research programs. Companies announced development initiatives. Governments scrambled to update their encryption standards. It was chaos. It was beautiful. It was exactly what Daniel had been afraid of, and exactly what the world needed. Richard Chen had called me, furious. He'd said I'd cost him billions, that I'd destroyed the value of the only breakthrough that could have saved his company, that I was a vindictive, short-sighted fool. I'd said, Daniel didn't build this for your company. He built it for the world. Now the world has it. Richard had said, you have no idea what you've done. The consequences of this will be catastrophic. I'd said, maybe. Or maybe people will adapt. Maybe this will push innovation forward. Maybe making it free means it gets developed faster and better. Richard had hung up. I'd never heard from him again. The media had tried to figure out who'd released the research. There'd been speculation about which company or government had done it. Some people thought it was a publicity stunt. Others thought it was corporate espionage. Eventually, someone had tracked down that Daniel Morrison had been working in that garage. His name had come up in connection with the address. Reporters had called Patricia. She'd told them to talk to me. Reporters had called me. I'd told them I was just following Daniel's wishes, that he'd wanted his work shared freely, that I was honoring his legacy. Most people had believed me. Some hadn't, but by then it was too late. The information was out there. Irreversible. Unstoppable. Today, 2 years later, I'm 39 years old. I live in a small house in Maine, far from Vermont, and the life I used to have. I changed my name legally. I work remotely for a tech nonprofit that helps develop open-source tools for education. I keep a low profile. I don't do interviews. I don't talk about Daniel or what he built or the decision I made. But I watch the news. I see how quantum computing is developing, how it's being used for medical research and climate science, and all the good things Daniel hoped for. I also see how it's being used to break security systems and spy on people and do all the things he feared. Both sides are real. Both are happening. I don't know if I made the right choice. I'll probably never know. Patricia hasn't spoken to me since the release. Michelle sends me angry emails sometimes, calling me names, blaming me for ruining her father's legacy. Ryan sends me a card at Christmas every year. Just a simple card with a note saying he hopes I'm doing okay. It's nice. It's more than I expected. Daniel's company went bankrupt about a year after I released the research. Without a quantum computing monopoly to base their future on, they couldn't compete. Richard Chen sold what was left and disappeared. I don't feel bad about that. Some things shouldn't be monopolized. I sold Daniel's physical machine to a university for $1. They're using it for research. Teaching students. Advancing knowledge. That felt right. That felt like what Daniel would have wanted. I kept one of his notebooks. The first one, from 2015, when he'd just started the project. His handwriting in the margins talked about how excited he was, how scared he was, how he hoped he was doing the right thing. I read it sometimes when I'm doubting myself. When I'm wondering if I destroyed something instead of freeing it, the notebook reminds me that Daniel had the same doubts, that he trusted me to figure it out, that he believed I'd make the best choice I could with the information I had. The $50,000 Daniel left me is gone. I spent it on lawyers and security and moving expenses, but I don't regret any of it. Money wasn't the point. The point was honoring Daniel, understanding what he'd built, making sure his decade of secret work meant something. Whether I succeeded or failed, whether I made the right choice or the wrong one, at least I tried. At least I didn't take the easy path. At least I didn't sell out to the first person who offered money, or let fear keep me from making any choice at all. I think about Daniel every day, about our Wednesday dinners and Sunday afternoons, about how he'd talk for hours about ideas and innovation and the future, about how he'd died before seeing his work change the world, but somehow knew it would anyway, about how he'd trusted me, the mistress, the secret girlfriend, the woman nobody thought deserved his confidence, with the most important decision of his life. That trust meant more to me than any amount of money or recognition or approval from people who'd never understood what we had. The sun is setting over the Atlantic Ocean. I'm sitting on my porch with coffee and Daniel's notebook. Tomorrow there's a conference in Portland about open-source quantum computing. Hundreds of researchers and students will present projects based on Daniel's work. None of them know who released it. None of them know about the mistress in Maine who made the choice to give it all away. And that's fine. That was never the point. The point was making sure Daniel's breakthrough helped people. Making sure his 10 years in that garage meant something more than corporate profits or government secrets. Making sure his legacy was measured in knowledge shared instead of money hoarded. Did I make the right choice? I still don't know. Maybe there was no right choice. Maybe every option had consequences I couldn't predict. But I made a choice. I did what I thought Daniel would have wanted, even though he'd been too scared to do it himself. I released his work into the world and let the world decide what to do with it. That's democracy. That's trust. That's believing that people, collectively, will figure out how to use powerful tools responsibly, even if individuals can't be trusted. Patricia was wrong when she said I threw away billions. You can't throw away something that was never meant to be sold. Daniel built that quantum computer because he wanted to prove he could. Because he wanted to create something that mattered. Because he wanted to change the world. I didn't throw away his legacy. I fulfilled it. I made sure his work lived beyond him. I made sure it helped people instead of enriching corporations. I made sure the question wasn't who owns this technology, but how do we all use it responsibly. The garage in Barra is empty now. I ended the lease, cleaned everything out, donated the tools and equipment. The space where Daniel spent 10 years building the future is just another empty warehouse again. But what he built there is everywhere now. In universities and research labs and hobby shops, in basements and garages and offices around the world. People building on his work, improving it, finding new applications, taking his breakthrough and turning it into 1,000 different innovations. That's better than one machine in one garage controlled by one company. That's what progress actually looks like. I finish my coffee and watch the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow I'll go to that conference, sit in the back, listen to presentations about quantum algorithms and error correction and practical applications. Hear Daniel's name mentioned occasionally, usually with the caveat that not much is known about him, that he was a businessman who became a researcher, that he made a breakthrough, and someone released it before he died. The details are fuzzy. The legend is growing. That's okay. Legends don't need perfect accuracy. They need meaning. And Daniel's meaning is clear. He built something incredible. He shared it with the world through me, and now the world is better for it. Messier and more complicated, but better. Some people would say I was stupid, that I gave away a fortune, that I could have been set for life if I'd sold to Richard, or patented the technology, or played the game smarter. Maybe they're right. Maybe I was stupid, but I'd rather be stupid and principled than smart and corrupt. I'd rather honor the man I loved than profit from his death. I'd rather live with uncertainty about whether I made the right choice than live with certainty that I made the wrong one for the right price. Daniel trusted me with his greatest achievement. He trusted me to understand what it meant. He trusted me to make the hard choice he couldn't make himself. I did my best. I released his research. I freed his breakthrough. I let the world decide what to do with quantum computing instead of letting corporations or governments decide for the world. Whether that was right or wrong, wise or foolish, I'll never fully know. But it was honest. It was principled. It was what Daniel would have done if he'd been braver, and that's enough for me. The stars are coming out over the ocean. I go inside and close the door on another day. Tomorrow is another conference. Another group of people building on Daniel's work. Another step forward in the future he helped create. I'm just one person who made one choice 2 years ago. But that choice rippled outward. Changed things. Set something in motion that can't be stopped now. Daniel spent 10 years in a garage changing the world in secret. I spent one day releasing that secret and changing it again. Together, we made something that matters. Together, we proved that love, even complicated hidden love, can create legacies worth protecting. And that's more valuable than any amount of money Richard Chen could have offered. That's the real inheritance Daniel left me. Not $50,000, not a quantum computer, but the courage to do what's right even when everyone thinks you're wrong. I'll take that over billions any day.